Okay, we're cleared for takeoff. Everybody all set?
Yeah, all set.
Okay. 3, 2, 1, now.
Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking a look at an aircraft that I know many of us have been looking forward to. We are of course looking at the DC Designs Concorde. We'll be taking a slight change of tack for the review today, nothing drastic, broadly the format will be similar. However, I'm pretty keen to find out for myself and certainly very keen to demonstrate to you exactly how the DC Designs Concorde operates in terms of a real world flight. We will of course be looking at the aircraft in terms of its modelling, texturing, sounds, things of that nature, but hopefully throughout our flight you should get a pretty good feel for those anyway. We will cover them off briefly at the end, but really for me the main focus of our flight today is going to be to test whether or not Concorde actually lives up to its reputation. Whether or not DC Designs has given us an aircraft that broadly performs to the numbers, is of course capable of cruising at Mach 2, reaching altitudes of around 60,000 feet. Of course there is no more of an appropriate trip on which to test Concorde than to take the aircraft for a run across the Atlantic. As you'll probably have guessed by the weather, we're currently on the ground on the London side of the trip, so we're currently on the ground at London Heathrow. And we're going to be taking the aircraft across the water via a real-world Concorde routing into New York's JFK. Obviously that is a pretty substantial undertaking for a typical review, so as a result today you'll notice that the video has been cut down into much smaller chunks. I've really tried to cut away the fat. Nonetheless, I have tried to include all of the major phases of flight so that you can see how Concorde behaves throughout. And again, really the focus of the flight here for me is to see whether or not Concorde can achieve its task. I think it's worth noting before we get underway that I did actually spend quite some time ahead of the review learning Concorde and its systems using the Collimata version of the aircraft for X-Plane 11. The Collimata version definitely a little bit more detailed, but I mention that now just so that any mistakes I make along the way, if there are any inaccuracies in the Collimata Concorde, then they're probably going to carry through to this video. As you'll see throughout the flight there will be quite a few differences between the two versions of the aircraft as we go. Also worth noting here, for what it's worth, the DC Designs Concorde doesn't pretend to be a study level aircraft, they are quite upfront about that. So if you are looking for an accurate rendition of the jet, you're probably not going to find that here. That being said, the aircraft is more complex than DC Designs' previous products for the sim. So we are going to be reviewing the aircraft with that in mind. I'm not going to be too bothered if we see inaccuracies along the way. What I really want to see here is a clean, decent representation of the aircraft, one that flies broadly by the numbers. We're going to be diving straight into our flight here. One last thing before we go. We're briefly going to take a look at the flight engineers panel at the start of the flight. We'll come back to look at it again at the end, but for the most part we're going to be operating out of the left hand seat, just for the sake of consistency. As a result, throughout the video we will have the flight engineer carrying out a few hypothetical checks for us. Worth noting there is no automatic flight engineer or anything of that nature included with the product. Anyway guys, as always I do hope you enjoy the video and find it to be of use. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Anyway, let's get underway and we'll head for the cockpit of Concorde. Okay, so welcome to the flight engineers panel. As I say, this is going to be the only time we're actually going to look at it during the flight itself. We'll come back and take another look towards the end of the video. So far all we've done is load up our 90 tonnes of fuel on board. We've got the battery masters on there as well. We've already run through the safety checks, so we're now down to the preliminary cockpit checklist. We'll run through that. So the ground power is set, equipment bay cooling can go on. And I was already quite pleasantly surprised to see that the equipment bay cooling is modelled, so we're off to a good start. Oxygen panel, unfortunately not modelled, but that is set. Drain mast heaters are on. INS 1, 2 and 3. Seems on the panel here we only have 2 INSs modelled, and they are not currently functional. And lastly, the air data computers can go on. And that's the preliminary cockpit checklist complete. So as you can see from a starting point of view there, the systems modelling is broadly what you'd probably expect, in that there is some detail there, actually a little bit more than I was expecting. But of course, once again, the aircraft not study level. There are systems that are not modelled or certain panel configurations that are inaccurate. Anyway, as I say, that's the preliminary cockpit checklist complete. We're now going to move over into the left seat and we'll run the rest of the flight from there. Okay, so we now got ourselves comfortably in the right hand seat, so running through the before start checks, the master CBs can go on. No click sounds associated there with the switches, which is a little bit of a shame.
Correction, good morning, Logan 051, descending flight 130.
So master CBs are on, cockpit prep is complete. Oxygen has been checked, windows are closed, flight control inverters are on, anti-stall system is on. Radar nest switches will set to rad. Instrument transfer switches are set. Altimeters, we're looking for a QNH of 1007.
X-ray contact ground 118.
So we have 1007 there on the left, and the same on the right. Nav radios we can set up for the departure, so we'll brief the departure momentarily, but we're going to be flying the Compton 3 Golf departure. That's based off the London VOR initially, which is 113.6. So we'll set that on nav 1. We have 1136 on the left, and we're going to be tracking out towards Compton, which is 114.35. And we have that set on the right. We're also going to be using the Woodley NDB, which is on a frequency of 352.
Contact ground 121, F53 MDX6. 051, and we're direct to that now. Roger.
And we have 352 set there on ADF1. In terms of our autopilot configuration, we're going to be climbing initially at a speed of 250 knots. It's going to take a little while just to scroll through to that.
Runway 10 right, clear takeoff.
Clear takeoff, runway 10 right, when the flight calls Mike today.
So a little bit slow here, I would say, in terms of scrolling. Holding down shift here as well, which should speed things up a little bit. So we have 250 knots pre-selected for the auto throttle.
Ryder 940 Charlie, 95180 on. 180 Ryder 940 Charlie.
And we're initially going to be tracking off the 256 radial from London. So we'll set that on my side. Scrolling for the radial seems to be a little bit better, it's certainly much quicker. So 256 on my side. After Woodley we're going to be tracking inbound towards Compton on a radial of 281, so we'll set that on the right.
Ryder 940 Charlie, turn left, left, close 1910.
And we have 281, and we'll be climbing up to an altitude of 6,000 feet, so we'll pre-select that. And we have 6,000. So the autopilot is configured now for the departure. Nav radios are set, brakes are set to park, throttles are in the idle position, nav lights are on, throttle masters are on. We should have a main or an alternate position there, but they do function. Ground hydraulics is set to yellow on checkout and off. That's actually modelled as well, which was nice to see. Batteries are on, INSs, again not modelled, but we'll say that they've been loaded. Airspeed bugs and pitch index. Unfortunately we can't actually set any speed bugs there on the airspeed indicator, which is a little bit surprising. And no pitch index either there on the attitude indicator. But we'll be looking for 250 knots in the climb. It's going to be 180 knots for VR. And pitch index we're going to be pitching up to around 13.5 degrees initially. Clock. We'd ordinarily want to set to chrono, but there doesn't seem to be that functionality. We'll try starting the clock though once we come up to takeoff power. And same for the TLA bugs, we can't set those. Anyway, that's the before start checklist complete. We'll brief the departure and then we'll be on our way. For the departure itself then, as I said, it's the Compton 3 Golf departure off runway 27 left. That's plate 10-3 Bravo, it's a conventional SID. Tracking initially runway heading, picking up the 256 radial outbound from the London VOR. We'll take that outbound towards 7 DME off the station, and then turning right onto a heading of 268, tracking out towards Woodley. From Woodley we're going to be picking up the 281 radial inbound towards Compton. And after Compton we'll be using the INS, or in this case really with the aircraft, the FMS for lateral guidance. Climbing up to an altitude of 6,000 feet, we do have a couple of restrictions there on the departure. We're not concerned about those today, we're easily going to meet them. No turns below 590 feet, so essentially 500 feet above aerodrome elevation, and of course not climbing above 6,000 without further air traffic clearance. So that's our briefing complete. We'll wait here a little bit longer as the last of the passengers continue to board the aircraft. And I'll come back to you again once we're ready to run the before start checklist below the line. Okay, so we do now have all of our passengers on board. We are ready to run the before start checklist below the line. So seatbelt signs can go on. Load sheet has been checked. Airspeed indicator bugs and pitch index. Again, unfortunately we can't set those. Same for the clock and the TLA bugs. Door lights are checked. Master warning. Unfortunately no test functionality there. Looks like we can't do a recall or an inhibit either. So we'll say that the master warning has been checked. Anti-collision light can go on. Engine feed pumps are on, and as usual we'll get the engineer to hypothetically take care of the de-air pumps, the air bleeds, the cross bleeds, as well as the conditioning, hydraulics and electrical setup. We're going to be starting 2 engines here on the bay. We'll be starting the number 3 and the number 2, and then we'll commence the push and start the other 2 engines once we're underway. Starting the number 3 engine first, so we'll hit the starter. Monitoring the N2 gauge there, we're looking for at least 12% before we introduce the fuel. Just come up through 10%. And we're just going to let the engine spool up a little bit further here. We'll see roughly where we end up idling. Looks like that's going to be just above 20%, pretty reasonable. So the HP fuel valve can go on. And just continuing to monitor the engine there as it spools up. You'll notice on the gauges there we only have the outer dial with the needle. We don't have the rolling counter gauge there in the middle, which we should on the real aircraft. Not a big issue of course, but it does make it just a little bit harder to read the gauges. Anyway, the UGT is coming up through 200 degrees, so we do have a good light off. Not showing a rise in fuel flow there just yet. So it looks like we do have a good start there. We're going to head outside the aircraft now to start the number 2. Looks like we have a good start on the number 4, so lastly starting the number 1. And again just keeping an eye on that N2. So coming up on 20%. Fuel valve open.
Dublin Runner 5 Golf Mike, we're passing altitude 2,300, we're climbing flight level 90 on the runway track.
There's the taxiway line for Victor, so we'll stop with the nose just off that. And we can stop the tug there. Aircraft stationary, the park brake can go on. And just continuing to monitor the number 1 engine there as it runs up.
Air Flight Golf Mike, identified climb flight level 120. Climb flight level 120 on a 5 Golf Mike.
And looks like we have 4 good starts. The galley power has already been selected on. The after start checklist, flight controls. So we have full up, full down, and neutral, full left, full right, and neutral, and on the rudder, full left, full right, and neutral. I'm not quite sure that the flight control actuation there is quite correct for the various ranges, but overall the system does work. Engine anti-ice, not required currently, there's no precipitation around at the moment. Brake fans are on. Again, I couldn't find a switch for those. I assume they're not modelled. Door warning lights are out, engine feed pumps are on, hydraulics have been checked, same for the electrics. Ground equipment is clear, the tug has now gone. Taxi lights can come on. We'll get the taxi turn lights on as well. And running through the taxi checklist, the nose visor can go down to 5 degrees.
Runway 10 right, you are cleared for takeoff.
Takeoff 10 right, departure on 323.
Interestingly there, the nose not actuating. Interestingly there, the nose not actuating without bringing the selection all the way down. We'll try going back to 5 degrees. I know that the nose can be modelled in various positions, so probably a little bit of user error there, but in reality we should just select the position we want. Anyway, the nose is retracted, the park brake can come off. As I say, we'll be joining right here onto Victor and then taking Sierra out for Sierra 1, runway 27 left. Just coming up on the throttles to get the aircraft moving. Needing quite a bit of thrust here to get the aircraft rolling, but we are right on our maximum takeoff weight.
Hello, Ryanair 940 Charlie, ILS 10 right.
Ryanair 940 Sierra Charlie, continue surface winds 160 degrees, 11 knots.
Continue Ryanair 940 Charlie.
And just bring the aircraft around to the right. It might not be a spot-on recreation of Concorde, but that's quite a nice view there with the weather and the panel co-pilot as well. So far the aircraft is living up to my expectations in terms of what I thought the product would be. And I have to say it has surpassed them so far. Again, it's obviously not a study level recreation of the aircraft, but there's a little bit more functionality there than I was expecting. Anyway, on taxiway Victor, we'll be turning right onto Sierra. And we're all clear on the left. So running through the taxi checks as we go. Flight controls have been checked, trims are set. Just get ourselves straightened up on Sierra and then we'll continue the checklist. Concorde's nose gear is well behind the aircraft here, so we're actually going to overjudge the turn. Might look as though we're over the grass, but it's only the aircraft nose, not the nose wheel itself. And now just following Sierra all the way around for holding point Sierra 1.
Over 051 direct to Nickel. To Nickel, Logan to 51.
And again, just overjudging the turn to bring us back onto the taxiway centre line. So, continuing the checklist, engine rating mode needs to go to takeoff. Interestingly though, the engine rating mode there seems to have been replaced with some engine start switches. Auto ignition can go on. Unfortunately the gang bars on the switches there don't work, which is a little less convenient, but it's not a big issue. Auto throttles can go on. And we'll just hold the rest of the checklist here, we're just approaching the holding point. So back off the thrust, we'll just bring the aircraft to a stop. Beam Sierra 1.
And Bill, if we could have the taxi checks, please.
Nose and visor.
There's down at 5.
Checked. Okay, brakes.
They're checked, back at normal.
Checked.
Trims. Trims I've checked, set for takeoff.
Set for takeoff.
And we're clear to line up after the 75. We'll have the before takeoff checks, please, Bill.
Okay, briefing. Any update?
No updates to the briefing.
Understood. Taxi turns.
They're going on.
Transponder.
That's 5257 and on.
Wheel light.
Is out.
Off.
Out here.
Quite interesting lining up on the runway. We're sitting here on the flight deck 35 feet ahead of the nose wheel, so I have to overshoot the runway centre line somewhat.
Okay, so before we depart we're going to briefly talk through the takeoff procedure. For those who aren't familiar, we're going to call 3, 2, 1 now. We'll start the chrono, jam the throttles forward, the afterburners will kick in. At VR we're going to pitch to around 13 degrees, the aircraft should lift off between around 200, 220 knots. Once we see a positive climb we'll get the gear up. Climbing away we'll just pitch to maintain a speed of 250 knots. And we'll keep a good eye on the chrono. Once we hit 1 minute we're going to call 3, 2, 1 noise. We'll kill the afterburners, come back on the throttles, and again just pitching to maintain 250 knots as we climb our way up towards 6,000 feet. So we'll set the park brake is off, and we'll go 3, 2, 1 now. So clock is running. Power is set. Airspeed's alive. It's 100 knots. And we have V1 rotate, so coming back on the yoke. The aircraft is rather heavy in pitch, you need almost full backstick to get the nose wheel up. And we're airborne, so pitching now to maintain that 250 knot climb speed. If you have positive climb, the gear can come up. And keeping a good eye there on the chrono. We have 3, 2, 1 noise. So coming back on the power again, pitching down to maintain 250 knots.
Okay, we're cleared for takeoff. Everybody all set?
Yeah, all set.
Okay. 3, 2, 1 now.
Speed building. knots. Power set.
And climbing away nicely now, so we'll get the auto throttle in. We'll go to IS acquire. Flight director can go on. We'll go into track heading. And we'll go for vertical speed. Autopilot can go in. A little bit aggressive there on the intercept for the autopilot. So the auto throttle should now maintain 250 knots, maintaining our present heading till we pick up the radial outbound from London. We're just going to hold the after takeoff checks until we're established inbound towards Compton, otherwise things get very busy. And getting ready to turn now onto our heading inbound towards the radial. We'll go out acquire so that we'll level off at 6,000. There's our radial, so turning onto a heading. Just wait until we come through 7 miles, and then we'll turn back onto a heading of 268.
Air 5 Golf, Mike, contact Dublin 129 180, right? Air 129 180 on Air 5 Golf, Mike, today.
There's 7 miles.
Yeah, that's 1 right.
And there's 268. We can tune up the Compton VOR now, which is 11435.
You got the uniform, let's copy, all the best.
I find the nav radios on the DC Designs Concorde a little bit strange. Don't always get the nav aid that you're looking for. So showing 19 miles now to run towards Compton, that's a bit more reasonable. Looking for an inbound radial of 281. So just waiting on that. Just about to level off at 6,000. And the auto throttle should come back to maintain the speed. Looks like the aircraft is going to level us off. Speed's just increasing there, so we'll go IS acquire once again. And just about to pick up the radial, so we'll turn inbound on a heading and then we'll go into VOR Loke.
Over 051, descend altitude 5,000 feet, QNH 1023 hectopascal.
So overall I find the autopilot is a little bit hit and miss. It has mixed results, but it does do the job. You do need to be quite proactive though with your management of it. Obviously we're in cloud at the moment, so we'll take the engine anti-ice on. Tracking nicely now inbound towards Compton, so we'll go VOR Loc. The autopilot is picking that up, but we'll keep a good eye on it just to make sure it does a reasonable job there of the intercept. Looks like it is. Come down to our FMC and we'll go direct to Compton.
Logan 051, contact approach 121.1, goodbye.
So we are now tracking direct towards Compton. We'll come back into heading momentarily. It says track heading. We'll go into INS. That should now be giving us INS guidance. So again, we'll just pick up the CDI bar and then we'll go into INS nav on the autopilot.
Logan 051, clear direct to right and special turn for final 4 right.
Just starting to clear the clouds here. We're waiting until we're overhead Compton until we get further climb. Showing 10 miles to run towards the station. So there's INS nav. The aircraft should now track us based on what we've entered into the FMC. And finally running through this after takeoff check, so the gear is up, the lights are out, landing lights can come off. Master warning is checked. ADS and standby heaters are on. Engine rating mode would now go to flight, but again that doesn't seem to be modelled on the aircraft, at least not correctly. Pressurisation is checked. The nose and visor can come up. The nose does now seem to be working correctly. Not quite sure why it wasn't actuating as we were expecting on the ground. Certainly a cool feature of the aircraft though. So the nose is up. You can hear the noise actually dying down there as well. That's a nice touch. True to life of the aircraft. Altimeters will stay on QNH for the time being, obviously maintaining an altitude. Takeoff monitor, again not modelled, but that would go off. So we're now just waiting till we're overhead Compton, at which point we can expect a further climb up to flight level 280.
Or 34 Juliet, good day, descent flight level 100. Yeah, flight level 100, Sherman 34 Juliet. Emirates 161, confirm cleared, high speed 320 knots below 1, flight level 100. Emirates 161, below flight level 100 you can reduce to standard speed, contact approach 121.1, goodbye. 121.1 and standard speed below flight level 100. Bye.
Okay, so we've just completed our turn over waypoint Kessup. We're now out over the Bristol Channel. And we are ready for our acceleration through Mach 1 and our climb up to 60,000 feet. First thing we'll do is pre-select flight level 600 on the altitude select. So we have flight level 600 selected. We're going to go into max climb. And we'll hit alt acquire. It seems like the aircraft doesn't want to climb unless we go into alt acquire. We are now climbing. The auto throttle can come out. We're going to go up to full dry power. We'll reset the chrono. We're going to time the afterburners. It should take us around 5 minutes to accelerate up towards Mach 1.7. So we'll start the chrono again. We'll engage the reheats in pairs.
99 for Sierra Charlie, contact ground 118.
What's the 110 right now?
And you can see we are now accelerating, getting a pretty decent rate of climb out of the aircraft. Just coming up through Mach 1, so we'll run our checklist items there. Pressure static heaters can go off. Engine anti-ice is off, wing and intake anti-ice is off, and the transparency and demist is off. So the aircraft should continue to accelerate and climb simultaneously. Currently it doesn't look like we're getting much in terms of an acceleration out of the aircraft, but we'll give things a little bit longer here, see how we go. Already up through 32,000 feet. I would say that so far, again based on my experiences with the Colomata Concorde, that the performance seems a little bit reduced in the DC Designs Concorde, but all we're really interested in here is can we actually get the aircraft up to Mach 2 and up to somewhere in the mid flight level 500 range. We are going to keep a good eye on that Mach number though. We don't really seem to be accelerating at the moment, and we want to be up through Mach 2 around flight level 510. Looks like that speed is slowly coming up, just coming up through Mach 1.1. It does look like the max climb mode here has us climbing in stages. We're now up at Mach 1.7, coming up through 45,000 feet. That took us about 6 minutes, so we're not too far off in terms of performance. We should now be able to take out the afterburners and continue just with max dry power, so we'll try that. And the aircraft should continue to accelerate up towards Mach 2. Continuing the climb as well, you can see of course the vertical speed falling off there. So once again we've more or less levelled off. We are still inching up on the Mach number, we're doing Mach 1.8 nearly now. Overall I would say that the performance is slightly off in terms of how the aircraft actually behaves. It does feel as though we're lacking a little bit in power during the acceleration phase. Max climb did rather bring us up in stages, but overall we have hit broadly the correct parameters there, which is actually really great to see. I'm pleasantly surprised. I thought maybe without the afterburners the aircraft was going to struggle a little bit there, but you can see we're doing just under Mach 2, coming up through 50,000 feet. We're just going to wait until we hit Mach 2 and then we'll be going into max cruise. Again, it is a little bit easier to see exactly what Mach number we're doing when we have the numerical readout there as well as the gauge. Getting about 250 feet rate of climb out of the aircraft now, so inching our way up towards 51,000 feet. And expecting to keep a fairly reasonable climb performance here. As I said, up into the early to mid 50s, although it does depend on the outside air temperature. So just coming up on Mach 2 now. We'll go into max cruise. And the aircraft should now maintain Mach 2 as we continue to edge our way up towards 60,000 feet. It's rather looking like our climb performance has died off a little bit here. Really, I would expect to see Concorde achieve a slightly higher altitude. Nevertheless, that is us now established at Mach 2. So I don't think we need too many excuses to head outside of the aircraft and taking a bit more of the majesty of Concorde as she makes her way over the ground at 37 miles a minute. As usual, we're going to kill off the cruise portion of the flight. We'll take in some of the external views, and I'll come back to you again as we're approaching our top of descent point in towards New York's JFK.
Good morning, that's so 27 Alpha Zulu, flight level 400 in Mount Memory, CPDLC.
Assault 27 Alpha Zulu, Shannon, good day. You're identified. Report ready for your oceanic flight level.
Currently back for oceanic flight level In about 20 minutes, order, so 27 Alpha Zulu.
That's copied. Go ahead.
We're flat out at the moment. It's showing an ETA SOMAX of 1125 and about 20 seconds.
Virgin 165, and that, roger that, copy. I'm going to speak to Shamrock here because, yeah, radar showing you there at 1126. I'm going to speak to Shamrock, see if there's any leeway in that restriction. Stand by.
Sure, we're showing 1125 and 10 seconds at the moment. 069, CPDLC level 350.
Yeah, that's
Squawk 2251.
Air France 069er, Shannon, good morning. Identified cleared SOMAX and then Gapley.
SOMAX is in Gapley, Air France 069.
Shannon, hello, United 15, flight level 320.
United 15, Shannon, good day, identified.
Virgin 165, Shannon.
United 15, thanks for asking, and we are able to accept our final, our oceanic altitude.
United 15, Shannon, roger, that's copy, clear, climb flight level 350.
Flight level 320, 350, United 15.
American 101, Shannon, you still on? American 109er, Shannon, can you give me an updated time estimate for Point Mallet, please?
American 109, we're currently estimating Mallet at 1126.
26 is copied. If you could make it not later than 26, that'd be great. Got some traffic restrictions on a minimum behind you.
Roger, we'll be there before 26, thank you.
Thanks.
So welcome back to the flight deck. We are now approaching the eastern coastline of the United States, just approaching our top of descent point. Overall we had some reasonable joy with the max climb and the max cruise modes. You can see we didn't make our way up towards flight level 600, we only topped out at around flight level 530. Similarly we were slightly shy on our Mach number there, maintaining just below Mach 2.0. Again, that does seem slightly off in terms of performance, but we were pretty heavy today and Concorde is very temperature sensitive, so I would imagine it's not entirely implausible. Anyway, 60 miles to run to Kenda as our top of descent. We're currently showing 76. A little bit tricky to see the gauge there without zooming right in. We're going to get the aircraft coming down slightly early, so we're going to out-hold. We'll pre-select our cleared descent altitude, which is 11,000 feet initially. And to put the aircraft into the descent, we don't need to take the auto throttle out. We haven't had that on as a result of not hitting max cruise. So what we're going to do there, typically we'd come back to a TLA angle, but there's no ability to set any TLA bugs there on the thrust levers. So we're going to come back to around 97% N2. We're actually going to be decelerating initially in a level segment. So just very slowly coming back on the throttles. You can see we're down to around 25 tonnes of fuel on board, so pretty reasonable fuel burn during the cruise. There's our 97%, so we're just waiting for the speed to roll back through to 350 knots. We'll pre-select that on the auto throttle.
79040 approach, setting 040, that's your RNAV X-ray 22 left approach.
I do wonder about the airspeed indicator gauge on the DC Designs Concorde. Interestingly, in the Collimata Concorde you come back to 350 knots. Once you're there you hit IS hold to descend. And it won't be until thereafter that you'll hit Mach 1.6, at which point you bring the power back further. Here we're actually going to hit Mach 1.6 before we reach 350 knots, so I assume that the airspeed indicator gauge there is not calibrated quite correctly. And as I said, usually once we hit our target speed we're going to IS hold for the descent, but I suspect given how the aircraft behave there on the climb we're not going to be able to go into IS hold without having the auto throttle in. We don't want the auto throttle in just yet for the descent, so we may have to get a little bit creative in terms of how we actually manage the descent itself. You can see though the speed is dropping off pretty slowly here, so we'll start briefing up and setting up for the approach as we wait for that speed to come back through 350 knots. So for the arrival into New York, we're expecting the VOR approach for runway 13 left. We'll brief the plate first and we'll set up as we go. So it's plate 23-3, it's a VOR approach, runway 13 left. It's based off the Canarsie VOR, which is a frequency of 112.3. So we'll set that on nav 1. I think the little button here in the middle is supposed to be an active and a standby changeover. We're just going to set that on both sides to ensure we are picking up the correct nav aid. We actually want 1123. So we have 1123 set on both sides of the nav 1 radio. We're going to be tracking towards waypoint Assault, which is based off both the inbound radial to Canarsie 043. Looks like we can't set that up now that we've got the rad INS switches set to INS, which is not accurate, so we'll have to set those up later on. On the right hand side we're going to tune up the Sierra Bravo Juliet VOR, which is a frequency of 112.9.
Alright, heading 040 for RNAV, 22 left X-ray approach. The next one.
So we have Sierra Bravo Juliet set there on the right side, and again we can't select our radials for the time being, so we'll have to set those up once we're tracking inbound towards Assault. We're going to be tracking overhead waypoint Kenda, then on towards Lind, Owens, and then on to Carmen. After Carmen we're going to be taking a heading of around 350 out towards Assault, picking up that 043 radial inbound. Final approach course is 041, that's coming off the Canarsie VOR, it's then going to be a visual turn onto runway 13 left. MDA is 800 feet. Just coming overhead waypoint Kenda by the looks of it. And looks like we can only set a maximum of 600 feet there on the rad out, so we'll have to go with 600, but in reality again it's 800. Aerodrome elevation is 13 feet. For the missed approach, it's at or beyond the missed approach point, a climbing right turn to 4,000 feet on a heading of 100 degrees. Out towards the Delta Papa Kilo VOR for the hold. In terms of terrain, the highest is out to the north of the airport. I assume some of that's related to the high-rise buildings, but MSA 3,000 feet, we're actually coming in over the 1,800 foot sector. Weather-wise, not a bad morning in New York. Overall, there's overcast cloud at 4,500 feet. Temperature of 7 degrees, QNH is 2995. Again, we'll set that later on. In terms of the landing on runway 13 left. We can't brake until we're below 100 knots. We'll be using full reverse and then planning to vacate off down the end onto Yankee Alpha, taking Yankee Alpha into Bravo and all the way along Bravo in at Alpha 1 for stand 1. Newark's the alternate. Again, we're expecting to land with around 15 tons of fuel. That's looking potentially reasonable at the moment. We'll discuss that more once we're back on the ground. Briefing's complete. We're just coming up through 370 knots.
Sir 511 cross cap is 2,900, cleared on at X-ray 22 left.
So just waiting for the speed to come back another 10 knots. We'll try IS hold. Otherwise we're just going to have to take out hold.
Takeoff at 2,900, clear the GPS to left, 511.
794 to center maintain 4,000.
4,000 to 794.
Once again, the autopilot isn't going to let us use IS hold there, even if we're going to out acquire. So we'll just stay with out acquire for the time being. Just keeping an eye on that speed. The aircraft having a little bit of trouble here finding the track inbound towards the next waypoint. Just coming back onto course now. Looks like we are maintaining our 350 knots. And we are below Mach 1.6, so we now want to come back to 84% on the N2s. So again, just slowly reducing our throttles.
Put on up to turn left heading 360, center maintain 3,000.
Left turn 360, to 3000, JetBlue 900.
And the power is set, just coming back through 51,000 feet, or flight level 510. We're descending all the way down to an altitude, so it's a little bit early, but just to save ourselves one less task later on, we'll set the QNH now. So we said it's 2995, we have that set on the left and on the right. Speed is just picking up again there slightly, but I'm happy to leave it for the time being. Descent rate's around 3,000 feet per minute. Anyway, for the time being, we're just going to continue here in the descent. We'll adjust our profile as we go, and once we come overhead waypoint Cameron, as I say, we'll be turning onto a heading to track inbound towards the Canarsie VOR. So there's not going to be too much more here for us to do until we've reached waypoint Cameron.
.794, Tim up 250, 6 from any, 2000 full established, cleared on nav X-ray 22 left.
Alright, heading 250, 2000 still established and cleared for the RNAV GPS X-ray, runway 22 left, JetBlue 794.
JetBlue 794, towers maintain 1.
Over tower, JetBlue 794.
$16.79, still maintain 3000.
3000, we're at 1679.
Okay, so we're just coming through 4,000 feet, descending down to 3,000, maintaining 250 knots. We're now picking up the Canarsie VOR, we've got 18 miles to run. Just waiting for the radial to come in, and then we'll turn inbound towards Canarsie. We need to be level 3,000 feet, 6 miles before the VOR itself. We've currently got 11 miles to do that. 700 feet to lose, so looking good in terms of our profile. On the RMI there, showing we're just coming up on the 030 radial. We're looking for 043, so the CDI bar should come in fairly shortly. Another 10 miles here before we need to be level. It's a mandatory 3,000 foot restriction. There goes the CDI bar, so we'll turn inbound onto a reasonable intercept heading.
5511, contact tower 119.1.
19 to the tower, 511 below.
And we can arm up VOR Loke, so the aircraft should track the radial inbound for us. Just coming up on our level off altitude. No problems there in terms of the restriction. We've still got another 8 miles to run. We'll run through our approach checks, so the landing briefing is complete. Taxi turn lights can go on. Radar nest switches are set to rad. Altimeters are set. Cabin signs are on. Engine rating mode should be set to takeoff, but we've discussed that already. Visor and nose. We'll take the visor down. A little bit of a change in textures there as you switch between effectively the windshield and the visor. And I think the issue we had there on the ground, actually the nose just takes some time to actuate. We'll leave it a little bit of time there. Looks like the aircraft didn't pick up the radial, so we'll have to turn manually inbound on a heading. There goes the visor. No idea why we didn't pick up the radial there. We were in VOR Loke. We'll get rid of that mode for the time being. And showing 10 miles to run now towards Canarsie. So another 4 miles will be overhead waypoint assault. Come down to 5 degrees on the nose. Just continuing our checklist, so brake fans again, I don't think they're currently modelled. Engine control schedule can go to approach. V pumps, we'll get the flight engineer to take care of the fuel situation, same for the weight and CFG. Airspeed indicator bugs, again we unfortunately can't set those, but we're going to be making our approach at 250 knots initially. We'll decelerate back to VREF plus 30, which is 235 knots. And then we'll come back to VREF as we come on to final approach. So that's the approach checklist complete. Just coming over waypoint assault. We've got 6 miles to run towards Canarsie. We need to be down at 1500 feet. So once again we'll go altitude acquire. We're not going to finesse the descent here as it's a little bit fiddly with the autopilot, so we're just going to descend straight down to 1500 feet. We'll run through our landing checks as well ahead of time. We'll just hold the gear for now, so the cabin crew have been advised. Nose can go fully down. Brakes will hold until we've got the gear down. Radar is set, and again the flight engineer can check the hydraulics for us.
2767, just to maintain 4,000.
4,000, Delta 2767.
Another 3 miles to run till we're overhead Canarsie. Just coming up on 1500 feet, 2 miles to run now. After Canarsie we're going to be tracking outbound on the 041 radial. Obviously we're not quite on course inbound to Canarsie since the aircraft didn't capture there on the VOR local hold. Nonetheless we are pointing directly to the station so we can track outbound still on our 041. The CDI bar should come across shortly. And we'll just maintain the radial, tracking outbound. We can start our turn at 2.6 miles. Just coming over the station now, levelling off at 1500 feet. There goes the RMI.
American 1679, just to maintain 5,000.
And the CDI bar is coming in. Tracking outbound 041, we'll keep a good eye on the DME. There's 1 mile, we'll start the turn at 2. We'll just fly the turn and the approach manually. Take the autopilot out, we'll start decelerating back to VREF plus 5.
Left turn heading 360 to the 794.
And there's 2 miles, so autopilot coming out. Starting our turn. Can maybe just make out the road there off the nose. Take the gear down. And we'll bring the speed back now to 205 knots. So we have 4 greens, there's the road. Doesn't look like the hotel was modelled particularly well in the sim.
Triple 902, contact tower 119.1.
RT1, triple 902, good day.
There's decision, so we'll continue. Can't make out the PAPI, we'll kill the auto throttle. So coming back on the throttles. There's touchdown, we'll go full reverse. Lowering the nose onto the ground. And going fully forward on the stick. Waiting until we're through 100 knots before we start braking. Just going to start braking now, we're eating up a lot of runway here even with full reverse. So the aircraft just a little bit slow to decelerate there. Anyway, we'll cancel the reversers, vacating all the way down the end as we said, off at Yankee Alpha. So we'll just let the aircraft roll through a little bit further and coming onto the brakes.
Notice Tower, good afternoon, Speedbird Concorde 188 Heavy for 1 right.
Speedbird Concorde 188 Heavy, those Tower runway 1 right, clear to land, wind 050 at 3.
Clear to land 1 right, Speedbird 188 Heavy.
So we're cleared for an approach. We're fully established on the ILS. All the radio aids have been identified and no problems at all. Have the gear down, please.
Speed's okay. 4 greens.
Okay, gear checks, 4 greens, nose.
It's down a green.
Checks, brakes.
Checked, they're normal.
Okay, landing check is complete. 300 feet.
Decision height.
Fire director's off.
200 feet.
264 Heavy, those Tower runway 19 right.
Southwest Airways arriving heavy Concorde.
100 feet.
1808.
50, 40, 30, 20, 15.
Stick forward, please.
Sticks forward.
Only Delta Star, try again.
100 knots.
1014, about 12 out.
75. 40 knots.
Thank you very much indeed.
So coming in towards the apron, stand 1 is right down at the end.
784, descend and maintain 2000, heading 340.
Center 2000, heading 340, JetBlue 794.
And we landed pretty much bang on 15 tons, so the fuel burn in the aircraft seems to be pretty decent overall. That was more or less what we were expecting to arrive with. There are definitely areas of the DC Designs Concorde that can be polished up. Again, the autopilot I find to be a little bit troublesome at the moment, but overall the basics of the aircraft do seem to be there in that you can broadly make your way across the Atlantic at Mach 2 at a reasonable altitude, and you can plan broadly accurate fuel figures there as well, so that's great. Anyway, stand 1 right down the end, as I say. It's quite a tight turn as well to come onto the stand. So we'll get the aircraft nice and slow, we'll get the taxi turn-off lights off. And again, we're going to overshoot the bay here just to put the nose wheel onto the centre line. Needing quite a lot of thrust here as we come around the turn.
Flight 767, turn left heading 360, maintain 2000.
360, 2000, Delta 2767.
And pretty nicely bringing ourselves there onto the bay. So off the power, we'll come onto the brakes. Park brake can go on. And running through the parking checks, the park brake is set, landing lights are off. We'll bring the nose up. Want to do that before we kill the engines.
Brickyard 4534, descend and maintain 4000.
4000,
The nose seems to animate fairly instantaneously there in the up position. It's just coming down that it takes a little bit of time. We'll get the ground engineer to connect the ground power cart fairly shortly. HP fuel valves can go off. We'll just leave the number 3 running for the time being until we've got some ground power connected. Throttle masters. Again, just leaving the number 3. Anti-collision light we'll leave it on until we've got the engine shut down. Fasten seatbelt signs can go off. Engine anti-ice is off. Ignition is off. And just waiting now on the ground cart, we'll get the flight engineer to configure the rest of the systems. So again, we've arrived on to stand 1 with 14.6 tons total fuel. Pretty reasonable there, I think. Overall, not a bad outing in the DC Designs Concorde. So there you go, guys. We did manage to take the DC Designs Concorde on a flight from London Heathrow over to New York's John F. Kennedy. The aircraft did manage to achieve Mach 2. We were a little bit off in terms of our altitude, but overall the aircraft performed broadly by the numbers. Again, the fuel burn was pretty reasonable. As usual, there'll be a conclusion section at the end of the video, so we'll talk more about that there. In the meantime, we are just going to briefly look at both the interior and the exterior graphically. Firstly, in terms of the cockpit, once again I would say very typical of DC Design standards in as much as there is quite a bit of artistic license among various parts of the cockpit itself. Nonetheless, when you enter the flight deck, you do of course know exactly which aircraft you're looking at. Overall though, with a few minor exceptions, I do think that Concorde is their best piece of work to date. Again, there are certainly some inaccuracies, there are a few rough edges as well in terms of the modelling. The colour of the cockpit textures as well isn't quite true to life, but I do think for the most part they've managed to create a cockpit which feels quite Concorde-esque. And looking over the nose, through the visor, tearing your way along at Mach 2, it's a pretty satisfying feeling. I like as well that the Flight Engineers panel has been modelled to a reasonable degree, so we'll just take another look at that now. So we find ourselves back at the Flight Engineers panel once again. I said we'd take another look before we finish up the review. Really just to give you more of a feel for the level of systems modelling that's gone into the DC Designs Concorde. Overall, most of the switches are clickable. Again, there are some systems that haven't been modelled, and some that I'm sure are inaccurately modelled. But nonetheless, there's actually quite a bit of functionality. For example, we looked earlier at the equipment bay cooling switches, they all function. The same goes for all of the various engine feed pumps. Pretty much all of the fuel panel is configurable. I haven't actually tried myself yet in terms of configuring the aircraft to see whether or not the fuel can be moved around accurately. Same goes on the electrical panel. All of the generators can be turned on and off. Same for the hydraulics panel. And same for the bleeds. We can turn the engine bleeds off. We can turn the cross bleeds on and off. We've also got the conditioning valves. There are certain things that aren't modelled. Again, I couldn't find the brake fan switch, and we only had the 2 INSs, but overall I think the level of fidelity actually quite a bit higher than I was expecting from the DC Designs Concorde. Clearly a fair bit of work has gone into the systems, and whilst again the aircraft isn't study level, I would say it's only above their previous output in terms of the systems modelling. As we saw during the flight, the aircraft does not in fact come with an INS, as is true to life. Instead it comes with a CDU. As I understand it, that's currently down to some gauge programming limitations on the Xbox, for which the aircraft is also planned for release. However, an INS is planned at a later date, and that's great to hear because really Concorde isn't quite Concorde without the INS system. Essentially what we get instead is an Airbus MCDU that's been broadly reconfigured to aesthetically fit in with Concorde. It wouldn't have been my own personal ideal solution. I'd rather have had some sort of a tablet in which we could fill in the waypoints and then just use the INS nav from there. Nonetheless, it did work. It got the aircraft from A to B. I planned the route out using the Sims flight planning tool. If you want to enter waypoints manually, it can be a little bit laborious. Again, not the most elegant solution, but a functional one nonetheless, and it does get the job done. I found it could be a little bit tricky using the MCDU for navigation. To aid navigation though, the weather radar on the aircraft has actually been fitted out with an Airbus navigation display. So you can see your flight plan routing, you can also see your next waypoint with some basic information such as ETA. Again, not a solution I'm sure that everybody will love, but it does do the job, and overall it functions reasonably well. Given that the weather radar implementation in the sim is still pretty poor, overall I think it's a reasonable concession. And there are a couple of nice little touches spread around the aircraft as well. For example, you can see here we've got the Haynes Concorde manual. We've already taken a brief look at the cabin, so we're not going to go into too much more detail there. Overall, the cabin modelling is reasonably basic, but it is nice that we have some passengers included. Lastly, we do also have a modelled and functioning toilet. Of interest to some, I suppose, but personally I'm not too bothered. Nonetheless, it's nice that DC Designs made the effort. We're just going to briefly head outside of the aircraft. Again, we've seen quite a bit of that throughout the flight, but there are a couple of graphical issues that I would like to highlight. Overall, the external model of Concorde I would say is broadly on a par with DC Designs' previous products. The aircraft does of course look like Concorde. There are some nice aspects to the external model, some rough edges as well. For me, one part of the external model, or the texturing, I'm not really sure which it is, but I'd certainly like to see the lines there on the fuselage cleaned up. They're pretty aggressive lines, they're quite obvious, and they really make the aircraft look a lot less realistic. So that would certainly be one of the first things that I would like to see improved personally on the external model. Generally speaking though, the model's fine. It's not up to the very high standards that we've seen in the sim, but again the aircraft does look like Concorde overall. At a distance I think the aircraft looks quite nice, certainly though if you get closer up some of the modelling is a little bit more crude. Anyway, hopefully our flight has given you a good feel for the product and demonstrated what the DC Designs Concorde can and can't do. As usual, to finish up the review and really consolidate everything that we've seen here today, I'm just going to give you my overall thoughts and a breakdown on the product. So my overall thoughts on the DC Designs Concorde are a little bit mixed. Broadly, just outlining my thoughts initially, I really rather fall into two categories when it comes to the add-on. I was actually really pleased to see that overall Concorde can achieve its task in the sim. We were able to reach Mach 2. We didn't quite make it up to 60,000 feet, but again Concorde is rather temperature sensitive. We were fairly heavy weight, so 53,000 or thereabouts isn't entirely unrealistic. I would have expected to get a little bit higher. But obviously if you are looking to purchase the Concorde for the sim, that's probably in part because of a love of the aircraft, but also you do want to be able to travel at Mach 2 and get yourself across the Atlantic, recreate some Concorde flights. That is possible in the DC Designs Concorde, and as we saw, overall the aircraft actually performs reasonably well in that regard. The aircraft certainly can't be flown by the book, there was quite a few nuances there along the way, but overall we were able to fly the aircraft reasonably accurately in terms of how Concorde actually operated. We were able to supercruise, which was nice to see, and for me one of the key indicators once again that the aircraft did broadly perform to the numbers. We did arrive with 15 tonnes of fuel, and that's pretty much what we planned for. Unfortunately though, my enthusiasm in that regard is somewhat tempered by the fact that the autoflight system of the aircraft really needs some work at the moment. I came away feeling like I rather had to manhandle the aircraft from A to B as opposed to it helping me out along the way. Quite a few of the modes on the autoflight system don't operate as they should in the real world. For example, we should be able to fly IAS hold using the autopilot, independently of whether or not we have the auto throttle system in. Similarly, the max climb and max cruise modes did get the job done, but it wasn't quite what I was expecting to see there. Really, we were almost carrying out step climbs to get ourselves up to speed and altitude. We saw as well that the autopilot can be a little bit hit and miss, it wasn't capturing VOR loc on the approach. But I'd really like to see the autoflight system receive a little bit more work, such that it can be relied upon. Anyway, with that being said, we'll briefly just break things down into separate categories just to highlight what I think in various areas. So graphically, both internally and externally, I would say much the same. Overall, the modelling holds up okay. The aircraft of course does look like Concorde, although there are a couple of rough areas externally. The same goes with the texturing, we've already touched there on the areas that I would like to see improved. The cockpit, as I said, does have that slightly uncanny valley feeling in as much as it certainly looks like Concorde when you walk on the flight deck, but if you actually pick it apart there are plenty of areas that are quite inconsistent with the real world aircraft. Flight modelling overall I thought was pretty good. The aircraft handled quite nicely during the takeoff, although it was quite heavy in pitch. Overall it was pretty easy to hand fly the aircraft, both during the takeoff and especially during the landing. Again, I do think that the aircraft felt a little bit underpowered, but again I'm just basing that on my experiences in X-Plane 11. The takeoff acceleration seemed a little bit slow, we ate up most of the runway there. Same in terms of the acceleration schedule up towards Mach 2, the aircraft didn't accelerate quite as quickly as I was expecting. The descent profile seemed reasonable, and again during the landing there we did eat up quite a bit of the runway, so I suspect that the reverse thrusters, again putting out a little bit less power than they should be. Most of that though is conjecture on my part, obviously I've never flown Concorde. Touching on the more unique aspects of the flight model, overall the aircraft seemed to handle most of the speed regime pretty well, no troubles there at Mach 2. And you'll have noticed throughout the flight I had some pretty egregious fuel management and centre of gravity issues there. Still getting to grips with how the CFG system works on the DC Designs Concorde, but the out of balance aircraft didn't seem to make too much of a difference. Of course in reality it should, but I think DC Designs have made the right decision there in simplifying things. Again, this is not a study level version of the aircraft, and if you were a complete newcomer to Concorde I think it would be a little bit too intimidating and daunting to start managing fuel systems, having to worry about centre of gravity, things of that nature. And on that note, it would be nice if there was the option to have a little bit more automation in terms of an automatic flight engineer for example, just to make the aircraft a little bit more accessible to newcomers. In terms of the aircraft sounds, overall I actually thought those were pretty good. The cockpit sounds fairly decent for the most part, there were a few switches missing sounds. But there was a decent level of noise in the cockpit, quite a nice change as well between high speed and low speed flight. We saw as well there is a transition between the level of noise once we got the visor up. External sounds pretty good as well, not perhaps true to life of the real world aircraft, but overall definitely gave a sense of power. The engine startup sound was a little bit meek, but once the engine's running they actually sound pretty good. Both at dry power and with the afterburners in, again the aircraft does have a pretty raw sound to it. Systems wise, generally speaking, I was actually quite pleasantly surprised by the aircraft. Again, there was more fidelity there than I was expecting. It's still a long way off study level and it is questionable how much is actually going on behind the scenes with some of those switches. But nonetheless, there's enough there to make you feel as though you are operating a fairly complex aircraft. Really, for me at the moment, the big issue systems wise that I still feel needs fixing up is the autoflight system. There wasn't really too many phases of flight where I was entirely confident to let the autopilot fly the aircraft. Of course, some of that may be a lack of familiarity with the DC Designs version, and again, you probably have to fly the aircraft as intended by DC Designs as opposed to how you might fly the real world Concorde. As I mentioned during the introduction, I would call this a Concorde experience as opposed to a Concorde simulation. I've made that statement with DC Designs products in the past, and people have asked what I meant by that, which I think is a very fair question. Overall, you can travel at Mach 2, the cockpit does feel the part, there's certainly something quite special about looking through that visor. The aircraft sounds pretty good, it looks pretty awesome with the vortices coming off the wings. And honestly, for me personally, I tend to enjoy the study level aspect of flying jet airliners, so the DC Designs Concorde doesn't tick all of my boxes. But if you do want a more casual experience, or perhaps a bit of an introduction to the aircraft, of course as well if you're primarily a Microsoft Flight Simulator user, then overall, once again, the DC Designs Concorde is going to allow you to recreate Concorde operations. Lastly, just a couple of notes in closing. Firstly, regarding the FPS. On the ground at John F. Kennedy, so obviously a pretty FPS intensive area, we were getting about 40 FPS in the DC Designs Concorde versus about 48 in the default Cessna 152. Secondly, if you did enjoy what you saw here today, I do also have a future mini-series coming to the channel regarding Concorde. That is going to be focusing on the X-Plane 11 Collimata variant of the aircraft, so it will be a little bit more in-depth. Those videos are actually already available to channel members and patrons as part of an early access playlist. And on that note, thank you as always to my channel members and patrons for all of your support, it's very much appreciated. I hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.